Paul had always loved hiking. The quiet serenity of the woods offered him a sense of peace that nowhere else could. He spent his weekends exploring trails in the mountains of his small hometown, always preferring to go off the beaten path, away from the busier trails. But on one particular weekend hike, Paul stumbled across something far more disturbing than he ever could have imagined. What began as an ordinary day in the forest slowly turned into a chilling ordeal, one he would never forget. Paul had spent countless weekends hiking in the woods surrounding his town, so when he heard about a trail that few people knew about deep in the mountains, his interest was piqued. He had explored the more popular routes too many times to count, and the idea of wandering into a place where few had ventured sounded like an adventure worth taking. The older hikers in town had warned him about going too deep into the forest, but Paul dismissed their caution as the ramblings of overcautious locals. That Saturday morning, he packed his usual hiking gear, water, snacks, a map, and his phone, and set off early to make the most of the day. The sky was overcast, but that didn't bother him. Paul had always liked the way the woods felt on gloomy days. The clouds gave the trees a dark, almost mystical quality, and the stillness of the forest felt amplified when the sun wasn't shining. It was quiet, peaceful. As Paul made his way to the entrance of the lesser-known trail, he noticed that there were no other cars parked at the small lot. That wasn't unusual for the more remote paths, but something about it felt different this time. Shrugging off the unease, Paul tightened his backpack straps and began walking. The trail itself wasn't marked. It was known only to those who had lived in the area for a long time, passed down by word of mouth from one seasoned hiker to another. It wasn't on any maps or apps, and that made it all the more intriguing to Paul. The path started off normally, cutting through dense patches of trees, but as he got deeper into the forest, he noticed that the usual signs of wildlife, birds chirping, squirrels scurrying, had disappeared. The deeper he went, the quieter it became. The silence was palpable, pressing in around him like the heavy air before a storm. Paul's footsteps seemed louder than usual, the crunch of leaves under his boots echoing unnaturally through the trees. Paul paused for a moment, looking around. The trees were densely packed together, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The trail had grown narrower, barely more than a dirt path now, and it was clear that few people, if any, had come this way recently. The underbrush was thick, and the forest floor was covered in a layer of dead leaves that crunched loudly beneath his feet. Despite the increasing sense of unease creeping up his spine, Paul pressed on. He reminded himself that he had hiked these woods countless times. He knew what he was doing. But as he continued, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. He stopped again, listening. The woods were completely still, unnervingly so. There was no wind, no rustle of leaves, no distant sound of animals. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Paul shrugged off the feeling, convincing himself that it was just his mind playing tricks on him. After all, he was alone in the woods on a gloomy day. It was natural to feel a little jumpy. He checked his watch. It was just afternoon. He still had plenty of daylight left and had planned to reach a clearing he had heard about, where the forest opened up to reveal a beautiful view of the mountains. But as Paul continued, the trail grew even more difficult to follow. The trees seemed to close in around him, their twisted branches hanging low, almost as if they were trying to block his path. The undergrowth thickened, and Paul found himself having to push aside branches and step over large roots that jutted out of the ground like bony fingers. That's when he noticed the first strange thing. Lying in the middle of the path, partially covered by leaves and dirt, was a backpack. Paul stopped, staring at it. The fabric was faded and worn, clearly having been exposed to the elements for a long time. But what was it doing out here? There were no signs of anyone else around, and the backpack looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Curiosity getting the better of him, Paul crouched down and inspected the bag. The zipper was stuck, and the fabric was stiff from age. He tried to pry it open, but quickly gave up. Whoever had left it here had been gone a long time. Paul stood, his heart beginning to beat a little faster. He glanced around again, suddenly feeling exposed in the silence of the woods. The trees loomed overhead, casting long shadows that made it difficult to see too far ahead. The trail ahead seemed to disappear into the darkness between the trees, and for the first time, Paul hesitated. Something didn't feel right. He checked his phone, no service. That wasn't surprising, but it didn't help the growing sense of unease gnawing at his gut. He debated turning back, but he had come so far already. The clearing wasn't too much farther, he told himself. If he could just push through the last stretch, he'd have the view he came for. Then he could head back. Paul continued walking, but his steps were slower now, more cautious. The silence pressed in around him, and with each step, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every so often, he would stop and look over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following him. But the trail remained empty. Then, just as he was beginning to think he had imagined the feeling, he saw it. In the distance between the trees, a figure. Paul froze, his heart leaping into his throat. It was hard to make out through the shadows, but there was no mistaking it. Someone was standing just off the trail, watching him. The figure was motionless, partially obscured by the thick trees, but Paul could see the outline of a person. A tall, thin figure standing perfectly still. For a moment, Paul didn't move. His mind raced with possibilities. Had someone else been hiking this trail after all? But why hadn't he heard them? And why were they just standing there, watching him? "Hello?" Paul called out, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet of the forest. The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. Paul took a hesitant step forward, his heart pounding in his ears. "Are you okay?" he called again, louder this time. Nothing, and a cold chill ran down Paul's spine. He took another step forward, squinting to get a better look at the figure, but as he did, it seemed to melt into the shadows, disappearing behind the trees. Paul's breath caught in his throat. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the spot where the figure had been, his mind struggling to make sense of what he had just seen. Had it been real? Or had his mind been playing tricks on him? He glanced down the trail, then back the way he had come. The woods were still silent, but the air felt heavier now, more oppressive. Paul took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. Maybe it was just another hiker, someone who had seen him and decided to stay out of sight. But even as he tried to convince himself, the uneasy feeling in his gut grew stronger. Paul decided then that it wasn't worth it. The clearing could wait. He'd come back another day, with a friend maybe, when the weather was better. He turned and started back the way he had come, his pace quickening with each step. The forest felt different now, darker, more claustrophobic. The trees seemed to press in on him from all sides, and every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of fear through him. As he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Every so often, he would glance over his shoulder, expecting to see the figure standing behind him, but the trail remained empty. Still, the sensation of being watched persisted, growing stronger with each passing minute. Paul's footsteps quickened, and soon he was almost jogging down the trail, his breath coming in short gasps. He didn't care about being careful anymore. He just wanted to get out of the woods. Then, up ahead, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The backpack, the same one he had passed earlier. Paul stopped dead in his tracks, his heart hammering in his chest. He had been walking for at least 20 minutes. There was no way he had looped back to the same spot. But there it was, lying in the middle of the trail, just as he had left it. He stared at it, his mind racing. Had he gotten turned around? But he had been walking in a straight line. There hadn't been any forks in the trail, no way to go the wrong direction. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He wasn't alone out here. Someone, something, was messing with him. Panic surged through Paul as he turned and started running down the trail, his legs pumping as fast as they could. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees a blur of dark shapes as he sprinted through the underbrush. The silence was broken by the sound of his own ragged breathing and the pounding of his boots on the ground. He didn't stop running until he burst out of the woods and into the parking lot, gasping for breath. His car was the only one there, just as he had left it. He fumbled for his keys, his hands shaking as he unlocked the door and climbed inside. As he drove away, his heart still racing, Paul glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. Standing at the edge of the trees just beyond the parking lot was the figure. Watching him, Paul never returned to that trail.